The outcome of the upcoming Ukrainian counteroffensive has a chance to influence the conditions in the negotiation room. It was Prussian General Karl von Clausewitz who said war is politics by other means. A famous quip that relates directly to peace negotiations because, as we'll see, the war conditions on the ground end up shaping the conditions of the politics in the negotiation room. When Russia's military first invaded and crossed their border, it took only 4 days for the first set of peace talks to begin. These initial talks lasted only 5 hours long on the Ukrainian border with Belarus, the same country hosting Putin's invasion force. Ukraine chose their advisor Michaelides to lead the negotiations for them. Russia selected Vladimir Medinsky, the Minister of Culture and career bureaucrat. Both men appeared to find common ground during the negotiation and planned 2 more iterations of peace talks before heading back to their governments to deliver the results of their conference. Remember, at this point, on February 28, 2022, there were 20,000 Russian soldiers assaulting forward with all the momentum towards Kiev, only 40 kilometers or about a 30-minute drive to where Zelensky was located at the time in Kyiv. Ukraine's negotiator, Podolyak, said yes, Russia wants peace talks. However, this is not a sincere offer, but a trap, because it's not about ending the war, it wants to consolidate territorial gains while it's at the top of its military capabilities. And in hindsight, he was right. They were at the top of their capabilities at that moment, and they had the most leverage for the peace talks. And here's where military outcomes on the ground have a major influence over the politics of peace negotiations. The city was under constant artillery and rocket attacks using thermobaric weapons. From Russia's point of view, looking at the conditions on the front lines, they had every reason to believe Ukraine would give in to their negotiation demands of complete demilitarization and surrender. But first, the animations and video editing today are only possible thanks to our sponsor, Morgan & Morgan. In 2020, there were over 5 million car crashes. That's more than 15,000 a day and 600 an hour. And did you know that you're not suing the person who hit you, rather their insurance company? Those in an accident can be entitled to more than you think. Injured and don't know where to start? With Morgan & Morgan, it's so easy. With Morgan & Morgan, you can submit a claim without ever having to leave your couch. In 8 clicks or less, you can submit a claim to Morgan & Morgan. If you're ever injured in an accident, you can check out Morgan & Morgan. For more information, go to forthepeople.com or dial #law. That's #529 from your cell phone. But Ukraine held out, and on March 3rd, the second round of negotiations occurred on the border with Belarus. Both sides appeared to inch closer to making a deal to end the fighting. Here, both Podolyak and Medinsky agreed on humanitarian corridors for civilian evacuation. Unfortunately, these agreements were either made in bad faith or Russia couldn't control their frontline units, as these safe corridors were shelled by Russia the very next day after the negotiations ended on March 8th. With trust having been further eroded instead of shored up, the negotiations ended. Local ceasefires agreed upon during the negotiations also only lasted a few hours long, according to multiple sources. On the ground, the Ukrainian forces had successfully repelled Russian attempts to advance on Kyiv on the 8th and 9th, leading to a complete operational pause by the Russians on March 10th. These failures were certainly hanging over the negotiations at this time. On March 10th, the peace delegation met again, this time in Turkey. The talks were between the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, and lasted only an hour and a half. Ukraine negotiator Kuleba told reporters afterwards that despite doing his best to seek a diplomatic resolution, his counterpart Sergei Lavrov appeared to stick tightly to Putin's talking points and lacked any authority to make a deal. The talks had started to become more of a stalling tactic for Russia. The conditions on the ground at this point were starting to sway a little bit in Ukraine's favor, with Russian forces only 2 weeks away from retreating from Kyiv at this point. And so out of these peace talks came a 15-point peace draft that involved agreements for Ukraine to renounce both NATO membership and to prohibit any Western troop basing. The plan also agreed to specific protections for the Russian language for those living in Ukraine and those who are ethnically Russian. As a compromise, the plan would agree for withdrawal to the pre-February 24th invasion borders and alternative special security agreements for Ukraine. Ukrainian negotiators even agreed to compartmentalize the Crimean issue as a way to bring an end to the war. Yet despite these sweeping concessions from Ukraine, Putin still rejected this plan. Why would Putin reject a plan to guarantee Ukraine's absence from NATO and protections for ethnic Russians in Ukraine? According to high-level sources inside of Russia, Putin had already rejected a deal to keep Ukraine out of NATO before the February 24th invasion. This has always been important for Kyiv because Russia could basically use the peace treaty as a ceasefire to reorganize, regroup, and attack again in the future. But the real reason why I think all the peace negotiations have failed thus far is simple. Putin thinks he can win. Because Putin calculates that there is more to gain from large-scale annexation of Ukraine. He's disinterested in coming to the negotiation table. For this, he only sends career bureaucrats to make false promises or toe the party line. However, since these initial peace talks failed, over a year has passed and a lot more has changed on the war side of the equation than the politics side. Russia currently occupies roughly 16.5% of Ukraine's total over 200,000 square miles, including Crimea, a percentage that has shrunk dramatically relative to Russia's initial occupation. With the recent addition of US and allied tanks and armored vehicles, Ukraine appears positioned to possibly push through Russian defenses and retake even more lost territory. Ultimately, it will be up to Ukraine if they want to choose to negotiate or not, and what terms they're willing to accept. However, this does not mean that Russia is now willing to come to the negotiation table because Putin has yet to deploy the majority of his 500,000 conscripts that were recruited during its mass mobilization last year. Russia is also strengthening new partnerships with countries like China that could be interested in taking a more active role in the conflict. This means that there is a strong belief on both sides currently that they are the ones who truly have the ability to achieve advantageous positions through military action. I think this is the main barrier to negotiations. War continues to be politics by other means. But does that mean nothing has gone right in the peace talks? Not necessarily. The first step in peace process is finding something to agree on. You don't need to stop the fighting to start negotiations. For instance, when Richard Holbrooke negotiated peace between the Bosnians, Serbs, and Croatians after the fall of Yugoslavia, fighting continued throughout the negotiation process. Russia and Ukraine have managed to cooperate through negotiations on various issues, including POW exchanges, nuclear power plant stability, and grain initiative that has shipped over 24 million tons of grain safely to international markets, grain that was previously held up by a Russian blockade. So agreeing on the smaller items facilitates a corridor for increased negotiations for peace. None of these agreements have gone perfectly, with shelling in and around Ukraine's nuclear power plants, reports of torture and mistreatment of POWs, and temporary blockades of Ukrainian grain. Despite this, these agreements are still proof that given diplomatic effort, finding common ground is possible. It's a glimmer of hope in a dark tunnel. But there's another problem: non-negotiable items on each side's demands. Putin gave an initial list of demands, announcing that he wouldn't consider any peace until the following conditions were met. First, recognition of Russian sovereignty over Crimea. Second, demilitarization of the Ukrainian state. Third, denazification of the Ukrainian state, probably meaning some form of regime change. Fourth, the guarantee that Ukraine remains a neutral state, meaning no NATO or hosting of Western military forces. What's interesting about these demands, what stands out to me, is that all of them have an opportunity for some kind of subjective interpretation. Only a demand for recognition of Russian sovereignty over Crimea is a point that's hard to spin. These broad demands give Putin the range to accept deals like the 15-point plan proposed after the 14th of March negotiations. If it suits him, Putin can agree to a similar plan and still claim that his special military operation was a success. However, these demands also sit awkwardly with some of Putin's other rhetoric, like Ukraine is not a country and Ukraine is historically Russian. By making a deal based on these demands, Russia would be acknowledging Ukrainian sovereignty. It is likely that these points are nothing more than Putin's emergency exit strategy. With demands that are flexible, he can choose when to negotiate. Afterwards, Putin can use manipulation of state media to sell a mission accomplished to the Russian people, even if it's a Pyrrhic victory that wasn't worth fighting in the first place. So let's take a look at Ukraine's demands to see where the two are really at an impasse. Zelensky's timing for when he presented his 10-point peace plan is the best example of war as politics by other means, because he made the demands in November of 2022 directly after his armed forces led an impressive counteroffensive, recapturing and liberating all of the Kharkiv region and the Kherson city from Russian occupation. The timing was right. Ukraine had gained thousands of kilometers of land and gained new leverage at the negotiating table for the time being. Conditions on the ground shaped the confidence of peace negotiations. Ukraine was now in a position to ask for their maximum demands. So Zelensky's 10-point plan, which was released in November at the G20 meeting, has these following highlights: radiation and nuclear safety, food security, energy security, prisoner and deportees, because as we know, over 11,000 Ukrainian children were sent to Russia. Fifth, United Nations Charter and Ukraine's territorial integrity, meaning Russia must reaffirm the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Sixth, Russian troops in hostilities, meaning Russia must withdraw all its troops and armed formations from the territory of Ukraine, claiming this will result in a real and complete cessation of hostilities. 7. Justice. This means the world would endorse establishment of a special tribunal regarding the crime of Russia's aggression against Ukraine and creation of an international mechanism to compensate for all the damages caused by this war. 8. Immediate protection of the environment. 9. Prevention of escalation. 10. Confirmation of the end of the war. From Ukraine's perspective, a non-negotiable is leaving the annexed territory. Evidence for this comes from a quote from Zelensky, who said, "We will not allow Russia to wait it out, build up its forces, and then start a new series of terror and global destabilization." However, Zelensky's plan was quickly and firmly rejected by Russia, who resolutely refused to entertain the idea of returning any captured territory to Ukraine. China doesn't mind throwing their hat into the peace negotiation ring, as we'll see. China announced their anticipated 12-point peace plan exactly 1 year from the outbreak of the conflict. China likely sees it as an opportunity to mediate peace for the war, which could bring them a new level of prestige as an arbiter of major conflict. Their peace plan itself does not draw any hard line for either Russia or Ukraine. Instead, the proposal asks in point 1 that both sides respect the sovereignty of all countries, the UN and international law. This surprisingly actually suggests Chinese support for a Russian withdrawal from occupied territories. However, the plan also recognizes Russia's security concerns in point 2, which says reject the Cold War mentality. In other words, China opposes the pursuit of Ukraine having the choice to join NATO. The China plan is indirect when it comes to details on how Russia and Ukraine should deal with the specific problems like territory, security, war crimes. Ideally, this plan appears designed to get Russia and Ukraine to the negotiating table again, where these details can be worked out amongst themselves. On the surface, China's approach goes against traditional American peace negotiation strategy that often takes a clear side of the conflict. However, US leaders from Biden to Trump were quick to criticize the peace plan of China's as a biased one favoring Russia. Biden said in an ABC interview, "If Putin is plotting it, so how could it be any good?" The United States intelligence agencies have released rumors that China was even considering possibly sending military aid to Russia in the near future. Beijing is trying to appear neutral, but leaked Pentagon documents suggest China has been attempting to send lethal aid and weapons to Putin by disguising it as civilian items meant for hunting. Despite these concerns, Zelensky appears open to discussing China's peace plan with Xi Jinping. Zelensky likely understands that regardless of the peace plan, he does not want to give reason for China to further support Russia's war, something that could happen if he flatly rejects their offer. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin warmly welcomed China's peace plan as well as Xi Jinping on a diplomatic trip to Moscow, saying ironically, "We're always open for a negotiating process." Is there anything we can possibly learn from Russia's history of resolving similar conflicts? First off, Russia has a long track record of acting in bad faith towards Ukraine. This is why future negotiations for peace are going to be met with extreme skepticism and mistrust from Ukraine. Russia has a pattern of changing the rules of the game or acting unilaterally in its own interest. For instance, at the end of the Cold War, Ukraine suddenly found itself as the third largest nuclear power in the world. The former Soviet Union had positioned 5,000 WMDs in Ukraine as close to Europe as possible. Then, after the Soviet Union fell, Russia managed to convince Ukraine to hand over the nukes in 1994. In return, the newly formed Russian Federation signed a document called the Budapest Memorandum, endowing Ukraine with security assistances to their sovereignty and independence, basically guaranteeing they wouldn't be invaded by Russia if they handed over the nukes. For years, the agreement maintained a balance between the two states until the 2014 Revolution of Dignity that ousted the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych. Putin then made the argument that removing Yanukovych was tantamount to creating a system of government to which the memorandum no longer applied. And so he kind of skirted around the legality of the issue, and he invaded Crimea shortly thereafter. thereafter. This was only Putin's first perversion of justice. During the Minsk peace agreement process to find agreements to end the war over Crimea, Putin continually denied Russian involvement as an excuse for not needing to participate in or adhere to any of the negotiation tenets. Again, we see the incentive for major nations like Russia to deny any official involvement in wars to avoid legal liability. And this brings me to my next point. Can Ukraine have peace without total victory? According to the U.S. Institute of Peace, the answer is no. Their January 2023 report on the peace process concludes Russia, like other empires, will need a military defeat to give up its expansionist goal. Any negotiated peace before such a defeat will simply let Russia rebuild its forces and renew its assault. However, Ukraine is not the first periphery country to go to war with Russia. We can take away valuable lessons from history that tells us how living with annexation is possible, and total military victory or defeat could cause a ripple effect of instability in the region. In 2008, when Georgia appeared to be considering the NATO alliance, Russia invaded and annexed part of their territory in an 8-day war. Russia de facto annexed 2 regions, cutting off 20% of Georgia's territory, similar to the percentage occupied in Ukraine. Despite this annexation, fighting in the region has stopped for 15 years. In 1992, after Moldova declared independence from the Soviet Union, its eastern flank declared independence as the Russian-aligned Transnistria. And in the end, Transnistria became an independent, functioning region, but lacked full state recognition from the international community. Today, Russian forces remain in Transnistria for security purposes, where the cautious peace has lasted for 30 years. So these examples show that while peace can exist with Russia and its neighbors after a war ends and it's been annexed, we can see it's done at the very costly price of sovereignty. This cost may be a line too far to cross for Ukraine's standards. So then the big question is, when will the conflict end? When asked directly how long the war is going to last, experts are cautious to give any decisive answer and settle at the ballpark of a few months to a few years. War is politics by other means. It's an axiom that reminds us that war, by its nature, is an extension of politics, and so is the war in Ukraine. It's a concept I think every average infantryman should try to understand, because the success of the trigger pullers in the trenches has an effect on the larger political picture, or at least that's how I interpret it in my dummy head. In this case, it's Russian politics that really matter, because in the words of Secretary of State Antony Blinken, if Russia withdraws its troops today, the war is over. If Ukraine stops fighting today, Ukraine is over. Presidential terms in Russia last 6 years. With the next election in 2024, I do not see Putin gambling with a negotiated peace in Ukraine until after he's cemented himself another 6 years in office. Consulting the court of public opinion in Russia may seem a bit odd to do with Russia, because after all, it's not a true democracy there. Even with low approval ratings, it's not like this will really matter at the rigged ballot boxes. However, authoritarian regimes are not immune to public pressure. This means that even in places where dictators control the institutions of the government, they still closely monitor and consider public opinion when making decisions. It's for these political reasons that I think it's likely Putin sticks out the war in Ukraine until after the 2024 Russian election at the absolute earliest. Then, depending on the conduct of the war, he may be more likely to seriously begin negotiations for a settlement. But peace treaties are following a weird trend in recent history. A great article written by Tanisha Fazal for the IPI Global Observatory covers the reasons as to why peace treaties are less likely to end wars in modern world. Tanisha notes how the absence of a peace treaty to conclude the Iraq and Afghanistan wars reflects a broader global trend. Signing such a peace treaty with either Iraq or Afghanistan would constitute a clear admission by the United States that we'd been in a state of war, and consequently that international humanitarian law applied unambiguously to U.S. conduct in these conflicts. For instance, alleged al-Qaeda affiliates captured in Afghanistan were famously not accorded prisoner of war status under the Geneva Conventions. The same would be true for Russia. If they ended the conflict with an official peace treaty, they could be admitting that they are truly at war, which would hold them to a greater liability, and something Putin has still not admitted, insisting that it's just a special military operation. At the turn of the 20th century, we can see nearly all interstate wars were ended with peace treaties, but today, less than half are. So today we're in a position where states no longer start off a war with an official declaration of war, and they don't end them with a peace treaty either. Instead of calling wars war, they're doublespeak called police actions and special military operations or counterterrorism to avoid liability in international courts. Since the 1990s, there's been new international humanitarian laws that have attempted to hold countries that start wars accountable. This has created disincentives for states to sign formal peace treaties as they try to circumvent the law, like Russia is, which is not great because research suggests formal peace treaties are associated with longer lasting peace. These conclusions are aligned with statements from the Secretary General of the United Nations, who said in January he did not believe there was an opportunity yet to organize a serious peace negotiation between the warring parties in Ukraine. If you like this video, I think you'll love this one about how the US Department of Defense spends $800 billion each year and it's still not enough.